I'm always talking about how being crisis ready requires a program rather than the old mindset of developing a plan. But what does this really mean, and how can you go about developing that crisis preparedness program for your organization? Hey everybody, Melissa Agnes here, and I'm here with today's episode of the Crisis Ready video series, where I aim to help you implement a crisis ready culture, one tip, strategy, or case study at a time. So I put out a call or request for questions that pertain to you and that I could answer within this Crisis Ready video series. And one of the big questions that I got back was, how do you develop a crisis preparedness program? What's involved? What's the file format you should use? How do you train and implement it within your staff? So I want to talk a little bit about that. My approach to crisis preparedness is by starting with thinking through what your organization's, the top 5 to 10 high-risk crisis scenarios that pertain to your organization. In a previous video, I discussed how to define a crisis. So if you think of that with that in mind, you can think through with your team, what are the top 5 to 10 high-risk scenarios that pertain to your organization. Once you have that list, that permits you then to dive deep into each of those crisis scenarios. So when I'm developing a program, it includes everything from governance models to escalation protocols to escalation factors. When is an issue and what develops it into a crisis? Or when is a potential crisis in standby, at a standby level versus an activation level? And then from there, you can develop action plans, which means, within the first 24 to 48 hours of a breaking crisis, what do you expect of your team? What does each department, what are their top key tasks that they need to implement in order to, as a whole, as a group, effectively manage this crisis? So department-specific action plans, senior management-specific action plans, as well as crisis communications. So when you look at each of these different high-risk scenarios, you can actually decide, you can determine your crisis communication strategy. When would your comms be reactive versus proactive? Which key stakeholders would potentially be impacted in these different scenarios, and what would they expect of you? How would you communicate with them? What are the communications that you would use to communicate with them? What are the means of communications? Do you have call lists ready to go? Emails ready, email lists or email addresses ready to go? All of these things can be thought through and used to, one, prepare the organization, two, minimize preventable risk, and then doing this, so to the question of how do you integrate this within the organization, how do you train staff and senior management, there's two things here. One, when you do it as a collective, when you're looking at your crisis management team as a whole and you're developing your crisis preparedness program, honestly, you should be including different members of your team, all your senior management, all your department heads, all your regional heads. Talk with them and get them to be a part of this process. So that's one way to instantaneously integrate it within the organization. And then, of course, put your plan to the test. Develop and conduct crisis simulations, which are team building exercises that allow you to test the plan and hone skills with your crisis communications or your crisis management team. And lastly, I had a question of which file format should you use? And this is a very interesting question, especially particular to me, because I used to do everything in Word. And then I had an organization, a client, that preferred things in PowerPoint. So I developed their crisis preparedness program, other than their comms handbook, using PowerPoint. And honestly, personally, I found that to be highly, highly effective. So that's little tips from me. That's my high-level overview of how I approach crisis preparedness programs, developing crisis preparedness programs with my clients. I hope this was helpful. Do you have any other crisis management questions that I can answer in a crisis video or crisis ready video? Please let me know, either commenting below this video or using the hashtag CrisisReady on Facebook and or Twitter, and I look forward to answering your questions.